So I'll be talking to you about my experience, specifically focusing on stroke with the large distal platform device on TracStar. There we go, thank you. The TracStar LDP provides an 0.8 intracranial access catheter that provides 15 millimeters of flexibility distally and a supportive proximal sheath. There are two working lengths that you can use for a TracStar LDP. The first is a 95 centimeter and the second is 105 centimeter. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and we have a lot of very sturdy people in Ohio, so I tend to exclusively use a 105 for all my stroke interventions, and I'm a little more discerning when I have to use it electively. The two features of this construct of this catheter that really makes it ideal in stroke thrombectomy is that the distal flexibility allows fantastic superior tracking of the distal aspect of the device with really one-to-one motion as you're moving the catheter up. And what that allows is for the catheter to get closer to the clot so that when you want to use your other aspiration devices that Imran will go through in his talk, you are closer to the lesion. And so should you need a second pass or a third pass, your setup is much more reduced in terms of what you have to do to get ready to make a subsequent pass. So I say this with complete confession here, and I know my colleagues are probably gonna furrow their brow at me. I used a stent retriever for all my cases for thrombectomy when I started prior to this work. And this was the setup. It was a Neuron Max shuttle, a Cat6 access catheter, a Marksman microcatheter, and a solitaire 6x40. It was literally the same thing every time. My outcomes were great. And then I had this case, a 67-year-old male presented with a stroke, and he had a right M1 occlusion. And so we dutifully took him to the OR for revascularization. I got past the lesion and did a microangiogram to demonstrate that. And I placed a stent retriever across the level of the lesion. And this is what it looked like when I was done. This was the first time it had happened to me, and it was jarring because nothing untoward happened in the case. You know, the shuttle sheath went up, the Cat6 went up, and I traversed the lesion without any increased difficulty from before, but it taught me something that maybe techniques matters, not in all cases, but at least in maybe an initial approach, and that got me thinking. Once I saw the availability of something that could track that far, I started using it, and I was lucky. I think I was one of the institutions that were able to get it in under COVID, so I've had time to use it since February, and I've had personally 40 cases of just thrombectomy. I have another 30 or so cases in other settings, but for the 40 cases that I've personally used it for stroke, I'm able to get to the posterior genu of the cavernous carotid artery in literally 95% of my cases. On top of that, I'll show you in some cases today that you can go even further should you need more support. Secondly, my stent retriever use declined significantly. And I will show you at the end of the case, for those of you who want to bring it into your institutions. I work at a public institution too, so you have to show both efficacy as well as a value-based proposition when you want to get these into your hospitals. And I have a great hypothesis here for you to take back to your institutions, because that's what I had to do for mine. And finally, looking at my own case series, I had a shorter time to revascularization. That comes from two things. One, that you do an aspiration first technique and you're finished, or if you do have to go with subsequent passes, and even with the possible need of a stent retriever, you're so far up that your ability to do that is much shorter in its timeline. So this case is a 71-year-old female that presented with a 90 stroke scale of 13. You guys can see a distal M1 occlusion. And what I'd like to highlight for you guys is I set this case up and then I had my resident do it. And what I told him to do was something very simple. You can see that we have the TracStar that is just at the posterior genu of the cavernous carotid artery. And then you're going to see a Zoom catheter go through it. So I'm just going to play here. I hope it goes smoothly for you guys to see. There's the Zoom. It comes in, engages with the clot, and then we're done. And then this is what it looks like when we're finished. You know, everybody likes to get revascularization times as quick as possible for the patient and maybe to be able to compete with your partners. But this one was really rapid again. I think this one took about 9 minutes and was the resident pushing. So it's safe and it was easy to do this. And it was it was because I had great distal access of the catheter. So how important is that 15 centimeters of distal flexibility? You can see that in addition, it allows you to get through something as much as a 360-degree turn. And this was another case, again, sticking with that posterior genu to get access, and it allows you to get those catheters up. For me personally, I haven't been able to get my previous shuttle sheets up through a 360-degree turn before. This was easy, and this was in my early utilization of the catheter, where I was still learning to get a feel for it, and it was really impressive to me how even in my preliminary experience with it, how easy this was. So let's talk about where we may need more lesions. We have a 72-year-old female here, presents with a United Stroke Scale of 16. This is where I opened it once, and I didn't show that picture, but now I had both M2s that were occluded. And this is the inferior M2 where there's the down arrow. And then I went there with a zoom. And then with the second one, I went with a second zoom. And I don't want to get into the zooms as much because Dr. Chowdhury does a wonderful job of that. But just to show you again, I was parked in the cavernous. I was pushing these catheters with no trauma. They went in easily. You can see what you're doing. And then you get a nice revascularization again. So another thing that I think a lot of people worry about is what about, you know, different types of lesions. This was a 33-year-old male who had an LVAD, and he presented with an M1 occlusion. And this was a case where I used the TracStar to get my access, and I just want you guys to see here that I get the TracStar into the M1. And I used a zoom, I used a stent retriever, I did everything I could to try and get this clot out, and I just will leave it as, if it wasn't for the TracStar 088, I would not have been able to get this revascularization. Finally, the next thing that you might want to think about is in the setting of a tandem lesion, right? The worry is that, well, it's great that you have all this distal support, but do you have enough that you can treat through a tandem lesion? Because the last thing we all want to do is use one set of devices to do our thrombectomy, and then in the setting where you do need to deal with a tandem lesion or even an intracranial lesion that won't stay open, do you have to use another entire setup, delaying the time to get durable revascularization? This is a left brain stroke with an NIH stroke scale of 17. There was a left ICA occlusion as well as a supraclinoid and M1 occlusion. So we were able to get up with our TracStar the way we are. You can see how far I got the TracStar this time. I'm around the anterior genu, was able to get revascularization of the intracranial, as you can see high up, but you can see that I have this severe stenosis that I have access with a wire up high, and I bring my TracStar down low. So now it's going to serve as my carotid catheter. And just, you can see, I sort of gave it away by showing you the measurements on the lateral there, and very easily through the TracStar, I was able to set up to place a distal protection device and place a carotid wall stent to demonstrate both revascularization of the carotid as well as a TICI-3 cerebral reperfusion. Finally, this is to help all my friends out there that say, well, that's all fine and dandy, but how do we get this in, right? So again, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, this was my setup, right? A Neuron Max, a Cat6, a Marksman, and a Solitaire, right? All my cases. Then I looked at the price of the equipment here, where we have a TracStar, a Zoom 71, and a marksman. And you can see the value proposition right away. And I was even conservative on that. There are some people who will have even less utilization than someone like me. But I said, look, I gave them 10 cases of both. And I said, I only needed to use in my first 10 cases of using the TracStar device, I only needed to use a mechanical thrombectomy device with a stent retriever 50% of the time. That has precipitously declined since then, but I wanted to use the initial data so I could be very transparent with all of you on Zoom with me today. The Neuron Max, 9 out of the 10 cases I used a stent retriever. You can see the time taken for a thrombectomy was a significant difference between the two groups. The TracStar LDP with stent retriever was 24 minutes, still better than my Neuron Max. And again, it's about having to climb back up there again with all of the devices. And then of course, with an aspiration catheter only, it was even lower than that. So what that can result for you, I took very real data. I took the previous year's thrombectomy numbers at our institution and basically showed that you save in excess of $290,000 just with this setup. My take-home point from my talk for all you folks here, 088 access, nice and distally, which is absolutely key, both in terms of support and to set up for a second pass. I'm able to perform it easier, safer, and faster. And for my institution, which are very happy, they've realized initially a 50% reduction in utilization of a stent retriever. That has actually decreased where I'm using it less than 30% of the time right now.